is a problem. Now he is starting to acknowledge culpability, although in an interview with the National Journal, he kind of dumped it on environmental officials, saying that they haven't gotten the change memo, those are his words, when it comes to how public agencies are supposed to operate.
That's Rick Pluto, Michigan Public Radio. Thanks very much.
A pleasure, Steve.
And in New York this week, a trial begins in a closely watched case of a police officer who's charged with manslaughter. Officer Peter Liang shot and killed an unarmed black man in a dark stairwell. As NPR's Joel Rose reports, a jury in Brooklyn will decide if that was an accident or a crime.
It was shortly before midnight on November 20th, 2014. Officer Peter Liang and his partner were patrolling the dimly lit stairwell of a high-rise public housing project in Brooklyn when Liang's gun went off.
It's a police officer's worst nightmare to have your gun go off unintentionally.
Ray Koshitz is Liang's attorney. She says Liang had been on the job less than 18 months when a bullet from his gun ricocheted off a wall and struck Akai Gurley several floors below. Gurley was taken to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. He was 28 years old. Koshitz says his death was a tragedy, but not a crime.
We're not talking about someone pointing a gun at another person and hitting him. We're talking about a round going off, hitting a wall, and then ricocheting and hitting this man. It was a really freak accident.
But Brooklyn District Attorney Kenneth Thompson reached a different conclusion. Thompson presented the case to a grand jury, and last February he announced an indictment against Peter Liang for recklessly causing Gurley's death.
We don't believe that Officer Liang intended to kill Mr. Gurley, but he had his finger on the trigger and he fired the gun.
After the shooting, Thompson says Liang and his partner stood and argued on the stairwell for several minutes instead of administering CPR. According to some reports, Liang called his union rep instead of his superior officers. Liang's lawyer, Ray Koshitz, disputes that.
He did have a conversation with his partner, but at that point, he didn't realize that Mr. Gurley had been hit.
The case has gotten a lot of scrutiny, in part because it happened just months after the death of Eric Garner, another unarmed black man in New York. Garner died after being placed in a chokehold by police during an arrest. Koshitz says Liang's case should be judged on its own facts.
This is not a police brutality case. It's not a police corruption case. It's a terrible tragedy.
Some in the Asian American community say the city is making a scapegoat out of Liang to distract from broader problems with the NYPD. But police reform advocates applauded the indictment, and they continue to push for a conviction. Demonstrators gathered 2 months ago outside the Brooklyn housing project where Gurley was killed to mark the anniversary of his death. Gurley's aunt, Hortensia Peterson, says a conviction would send a clear message to police in New York and across the country.
You took an oath to serve and protect the community, not take their lives. Okay, and for Peter Liang to go to jail, if that's what it takes for that message to be sent, then so be it.
But Brooklyn DA Kenneth Thompson says don't read too much into the charges.
This case has nothing to do with Ferguson or Eric Gardner or any other case. This case has to do with an innocent man who lost his life.
If he's convicted, Officer Liang could spend up to 15 years in prison. He's also facing a civil lawsuit by Akai Gurley's domestic partner and possible discipline from the NYPD itself. Joel Rose, NPR News, New York.
You're listening to Morning Edition on WNYC in New York. I'm Richard Hake. The time is 7:41, currently 22 degrees in New York City. Stay tuned. We're going to speak to New Jersey Public Radio's Matt Katz on his new book, which is out today, on Governor Chris Christie. That story coming up. Sunny and windy today. Cold. Highs will be in the mid-20s with wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour. Mostly clear and windy this evening. Lows will be in the lower 20s, still breezy with wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour. Tomorrow, a little bit warmer. Highs will be in the mid-30s, but still kind of breezy and mostly sunny. And then Thursday should be mostly sunny with highs in the mid-30s. Right now in Central Park, it is 22 degrees.
WNYC is supported by Eclipsed, a new Broadway play. Lupita Nyong'o of 12 Years a Slave stars in the story about 5 resilient Liberian women. Limited engagement. Previews begin February 23rd. Tickets at eclipsedbroadway.com. Leadership support for the Jerome L. Green Performance Space is provided by the Jerome L. Green Foundation.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Dave Mattingly. A UN report describes as staggering the number of civilians killed in Iraq between January of 2014 and last October. Nearly 19,000 were killed and more than 36,000 wounded as Iraqi forces battled ISIS militants. That report cites hundreds of Iraqi children in Mosul abducted by ISIS for training as child soldiers. The European Union continues to insist any agreements it makes with Israel do not apply to Israeli settlements in the West Bank or other areas Israel occupied in 1967. Here's NPR's Emily Harris.
A couple of months ago, the EU approved labeling certain consumer goods to show if they come from settlements. Europe has concerns about Israel tearing down Palestinian buildings in the West Bank, including some funded by European countries. Europe says its policy is to keep a two-state solution alive, but Israel calls this discrimination.
Goodwill says it's closed nearly 30 locations in Canada. Ann Karpenchuk reports from Toronto.
CEO Keiko Nakamura says Goodwill operates on a very narrow margin, and most people don't realize how many workers it takes to sort and process donations. Staff hours have already been cut back, and she's working with stakeholders and government to try to find a solution. But until that happens, 16 stores, 10 donation centers, and 2 offices in Toronto, as well as Eastern and Northern Ontario, will remain closed.
I'm Dave Mattingly, NPR News in Washington.
I'm Richard Hake on WNYC in New York. Mayor de Blasio is defending a traffic study that found Uber is not behind a recent increase in congestion in Manhattan. The study released late last week has come under some criticism for not being rigorous enough. But speaking yesterday, the mayor says you can tell the study's trustworthy because it flies in the face of what City Hall believed.
I would say a study that points out a truth that is different than some of what we assumed previously is a study that has real integrity.
Last year, the de Blasio administration tried to cap e-hail services because of concerns about traffic. The study did point out some downsides to the e-hail industry. The vehicles don't have to be wheelchair accessible, which is a growing problem for disabled riders. And companies like Uber and Lyft don't pay the same 50-cent transit surcharge that yellow cabs do. New York City will get $176 million in federal money to build a new flood protection system around Lower Manhattan. This is according to the New York Times. Senator Chuck Schumer says the city won a national contest through the Department of Housing and Urban Development to help communities recover from and prepare for disasters. The specific measures to protect the area between Montgomery Street and the north end of Battery Park City haven't been decided yet, but may include seawalls and grass berms. Sunny, windy, cold today. Highs expected in the mid-20s with wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour.
The tragedy of Flint's discontented winter. Poisoned water, now a federal disaster zone. Can taxpayers bail the lead and other chemicals out of Flint's water? That's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
It's Morning Edition. I'm Richard Hake. New Jersey Public Radio's Matt Katz has covered Governor Chris Christie for more than 5 years. For the past 2 of those years, he was writing a book about him. The book, American Governor, Chris Christie's Bridge to Redemption. It publishes today from Simon & Schuster. We'll be hearing stories from the book about the politics of Chris Christie. Today, Matt joins us to discuss what he has learned about Christie, the person. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Richard.
So, in the course of your reporting for the book, you uncovered some interesting facts about his ancestry. What are some of the highlights?
Yeah, Christie likes to say he's half Irish and half Italian, but many of his ancestors actually came from Germany in the 1850s and 1860s. They were likely fleeing the wars of German unification, which means, and this is obviously interesting given today's politics, they were war refugees. All of his ancestors lived in Newark, mostly working factory jobs. Some struggled with unemployment and alcoholism. His grandmother got divorced after she caught her husband cheating, and divorce, of course, was a
rare back then in the 1940s. It was still a rare thing to do in the 1950s when his own mother then divorced her first husband, who was abusive. And then Christie's parents, although they never divorced, they did fight all the time, which had an effect on young Chris.
Yeah, tell us about that. How so?
Well, in that household, Chris became a peacemaker of sorts, and at the same time, he also inherited his mother's argumentative style. Strong women in his life are critically important. He was closest to his mother and his grandmother growing up. He'd stay at his grandmother's house many weekends. She'd take him to museums in New York. They'd watch Meet the Press together. But divorce loomed large, and Christie himself has had his own marital problems. He and Mary Pat Foster married shortly after they graduated from college, but the year was 1986 when the Mets were making a miracle playoff run, and after work every day, Mary Pat wanted to talk about their days at work, but Chris wanted to watch the Mets. And believe it or not, this caused a considerable amount of tension. They went to marriage counseling for a time, and they actually delayed having children until about 7 years into their marriage when they felt things were more stable. But even to this day, Christie told me, they argue loudly. And since he doesn't want to expose his kids to the same arguing that he used to hear back at his house, they argue in Mary Pat's walk-in closet away from the kids.
But the public, you can say, that has certainly seen that side of Chris Christie. I mean, he yells at people, sometimes at press conferences, sometimes when they don't want to leave the beach when a storm approaches, right?
That's true, and he's yelled at me as well. In the book, I recount a moment where I did a story he didn't like, and I was escorted to the back of his SUV. He got on the passenger side in the front of the vehicle, turned around, and with his finger pointing at me very directly and intimidatingly, he communicated his displeasure with this particular article. But he can be very intense. He can be a close talker. When I sat down with him for one of the 2 interviews I did specifically for this book, he didn't like the direction I was going in on some of my questions, which were about Bridgegate, and then with some very colorful language, he threatened to kick me out of his office.
So, I mean, he's been criticized as being a bully. Would you call him a bully?
I wouldn't. I would actually say I just think he's deeply emotional. After Sandy, I saw the other side. I saw up close how he'd warmly hug victims. I've seen him hold back tears and talking to Oprah Winfrey, for example, about his lifelong struggles with weight, which really makes him very human. And a couple days after Bridgegate broke, I walked by his office in the State House, and he seemed really crestfallen. I was able to peer in and see and look at him, and I figured it was about the scandal, but I walked in the office, and in fact, he had just returned from the funeral for the wife of one of his cabinet members who had died in a tragic car accident, and he recounted to me in starkly emotional terms what it was like at this funeral. This cabinet member, Civil Service Commission Chair Bob Check, has Lou Gehrig's disease and can't move his hands, and he couldn't get his wheelchair into the pews at the funeral. So Christie described how Check's daughters had to keep going into the aisle to wipe tears from their father's eyes. And the moment, Christie told me, just put the whole Bridgegate saga into perspective for him. It was impossible not to believe the governor at the time because of how powerfully he told me the story, and he also wouldn't, by the way, let me report on it at the time.
And Matt, just briefly, any weaknesses that you found?
Fame and celebrity and a taste for the high life. His propensity for being friends with famous people has been a bit of a liability for him. He allowed the King of Jordan to cover costs for an extravagant weekend in the desert, and Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, who has a huge contract with the Port Authority, sent Christie to several Dallas Cowboys games. So I wonder how the governor will adjust to life as a regular person if the president thing doesn't work out and after he stops being governor in 2017.
Okay, well, everyone can read more about it in your new book. It's called American Governor Chris Christie's Bridge to Redemption. It's out today from Simon & Schuster. New Jersey Public Radio's Matt Katz. Matt, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Richard.
Support for NPR comes from WNYC members and from Progressive Insurance, with insurance for cars, home, boat, motorcycles, RVs, and commercial vehicles at 1-800-PROGRESSIVE and Progressive.com. And UMA, a cloud-based phone service working to help small businesses run efficiently and improve customer experience, with mobile features to stay connected from anywhere. UMA, the smartphone for your business. More at OOMA.com.
A sunny day today, but very windy and continued cold. Highs only in the mid-20s. We'll have wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour, making it feel much colder. Clear and windy tonight. Lows in the lower 20s. Still winds gusting up to 40 miles per hour. A little warmer warmer tomorrow with highs in the mid-30s. Right now in Central Park, it is 22 degrees.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Steve Inskeep.
And I'm Renee Montagne. The Australian Open began today with a bang. The world's former #1 player, Rafael Nadal, was knocked out in the first round by Fernando Verdasco. But even that news is overshadowed by a report by the BBC and BuzzFeed that professional tennis suppressed internal investigations into match rigging for nearly a decade, allowing players flagged in reports to keep playing. Among them, some of the top-ranked players in the world. No names have emerged of any players, but the Association of Tennis Professionals denies that it suppressed any evidence of match fixing. Joining us now on the line from London is Paul Scotney. He's the Director of Sports Integrity Services, and he's one of the lead investigators that issued an initial report to tennis officials about match fixing back in 2008. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, good morning. You're welcome.
We should say here that tennis officials were the ones, again, that first commissioned you to look into match fixing.
Yes, that's right. I mean, at the time I was working for another sport of horse racing, which we're very much used to dealing with issues around betting because we exist for betting purposes. So the tennis authorities wanted some assistance and we helped them do it.
Well, there was one match in particular in Poland that had caught their attention. What raised red flags on that one?
The betting on it was so suspicious. In a tennis match where you have someone ranked 5 and someone ranked 80-something, you would normally expect the person ranked 5 to be the favourite in that match. But in this case, that wasn't the issue. The player ranked 80-something was trading as the favourite because of the volume of money for him. So the betting industry at the time thought that suspicious. And then the way the match itself played out, they were further suspicious about it. So it was the betting industry that reported it to the tennis authorities to say that they think there was something corrupt about the match.
Once you moved beyond that one match, what else did you find?
As we carried out the investigation, we came across, mainly through contact with betting operators, a variety of other matches that were suspicious. And suspicious in the same way as the one that we originally investigated.
And that's the beginning of the story, obviously, which now continues or has emerged again these years later.
Yes, I mean, again, to be fair to tennis, I don't know what rules they had in place at the time, but I suspect the rules were not in the same position that ours were. In the sport that I was working, where we had very specific rules to deal and sanction players, to get access to telephone records, to get players to come to interviews. It may be that the tennis's rules at that time were not fit for purpose because this was before they set up their integrity unit.
What do you think would be the next steps for tennis officials?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't just an issue for tennis. It's an issue for all sports. The question is, what do sports need to do? They need to work with the betting industry and betting operators because betting across the globe is going to continue. So there needs to be an acceptance, and tennis is one of the 3 top sports for betting.